mentioned an extraordinary number of American troops in Puerto Rico, I believe. Correct me if my belief, is wrong. There are also 10,000 Marines off the coast of Venezuela in these various ships. Well, I'd be surprised if they weren't, because the one thing that's easily seized is the international airport. The Boulevard International Airport. It's right on the coast. A couple of thousand Marines should be able to secure that, airport very, very easily. Now what happens after you secure the airport? How? How do you bring in other troops? Where do they go? Caracas is a little further inland, and it's surrounded by mountains and hills. There are some tunnels that go through the mountain and hills into Caracas. How do we get in there? I guess, we could fly. I guess you could also have airborne drops. I hear a lot from my friends on active duty about repeating, Panama. You know, one of the airborne assault. You have all of these light infantry-centric generals at the top of the army that just can't wait to launch another airborne assault. The problem is that Venezuela is not a Panama judge. Venezuela is huge. You can get in, I think, fairly easily, particularly given the offshore presence that we've got. But then, what do you do when you get there? And how do you plan to get out? I mean, unless you can very rapidly install a new government that is friendly to you, that can maintain some level of order in the country, you face the possibility of total disintegration of public order. That means that you have no control over what goes on inside the country, and everyone and their brother can possibly take a shot at you. A Macgregor's point is simple. Getting in is easy. Getting out is the nightmare. Seizing an airport is one thing, but Venezuela isn't Panama. It's huge, mountainous, and unpredictable. Unless you can instantly install a stable government, which, to do for decades, you risk total chaos. In plain terms, America can enter Venezuela. It just has no plan for what happens next. They've got 30 million people. How many of those will resist is anybody's guess. But I just don't see how the Panamanian experience really informs us in Venezuela. Now, there is also talk about getting into Venezuela, if for no other reason, to stop the supply of oil to Cuba, which has been an important lifeline. That would align with Secretary of State Rubio's long-term goals in the Caribbean basin. But again, we don't know where all the air and missile defense capabilities are on the ground that the Russians have provided, and we're not even sure that what won't ensue is something similar to the proxy war we've been waging in Ukraine against Russia, that the Russians would turn around and effectively wage a similar proxy war against us in Venezuela, using Brazilian, Colombian, as well as Venezuela paramilitaries to attack us. I mean, the whole thing is a disaster, in my judgment. Macgregor's warning here is blunt. Venezuela isn't just bigger than Panama. It's a powder keg. 30 million people, Russian air defenses on the ground, and the real possibility of Moscow flipping the script and waging a proxy war against us in America's own backyard. In simple terms, an invasion wouldn't stabilize anything. It could ignite a regional firestorm. Rubio also knows that Cuba is probably weaker today than it has ever been in its history. There's really nothing in Cuba anymore but poverty. And he may regard this as a golden opportunity to knock off the regime in Cuba as well, especially once you've strangled the Maduro regime in Caracas. I mean, this is all speculative. I obviously, neither you nor I conclude that there's a lot more going on here than simply a regime change in Venezuela. Macgregor is hinting at the bigger picture here. If Venezuela falls, Cuba becomes the next target. Weak, isolated, and hanging by a thread. And that's why he's saying this isn't just regime change. In simple terms, the scale of U.S. forces suggests a regional operation, not a single country mission. There's far more in play than Washington is admitting. Challenge in U.S. foreign policy is to link the contingencies of power with the principles of justice. I don't think the principles of justice mean anything anymore in Washington, D.C. They haven't for a very long time. So you're looking at finding a way to collateralize all of these, mineral resources, oil, gas, emeralds, gold, rare earths, all that sort of thing. And people that are in the banking industry have privately told me, well, I guess if you can go in there and you could exert absolute authority over that changes everything. When a population no longer believes in a war, the political structure built on that war starts to crumble. And the deeper truth he's highlighting is this. Ignoring Russia's security concerns didn't make the conflict disappear. It guaranteed escalation. And now the consequences are landing, and people across the region are realizing this has to end before it destroys what's left. Imports roughly 80% of Iran's oil. Very interested in ensuring the Straits of Hormuz stay open. So how far can you press this war with Iran? That leads you to new places, new locations where you can get at the resources that you need to boost the American economy and deal with this enormous sovereign national debt. So yes, I imagine some of the same billionaires who are involved in both the war with Russia and the war with Iran, the Greater Israel Project, are also very interested in Venezuela because it may be that the other two projects are going to fail. One can argue that's already failed in Russia. Now the next one is, are we ever going to make any progress in the Middle East? Doesn't look very encouraging right now. So Venezuela then becomes an attractive goal or object in some people protecting Iran's oil. The old strategy won't work. So Venezuela becomes the new prize. In simple terms, failed wars shift the hunt, not the mindset. You mentioned Germany. Is Germany going to leave NATO and the EU in order to become independent again? It will have to. It doesn't have any choice. The globalists are a legacy of the Second World War. Remember the famous statement. Everybody used to chuckle over it. NATO exists to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. You know, in the 1990s, when I would hear that crap, I was furious, because here the Germans were probably the single most reliable and loyal component of the NATO alliance. And people continue to recite that insulting nonsense. I think the Germans have had it. When this government goes, whatever government replaces them will be a nationalist government. And that will continue. It may be that you get the AfD, but they're not the final answer. You're going to see a succession of governments, of these countries, all of which are going to be nationalist. And when I say nationalist, they're all going to be France first, Britain first, Germany first. Macgregor's point is clear. The post-World War II system that kept Germany down is collapsing. As economic pressure rises and public trust evaporates, Germany, like the rest of Europe, is shifting toward nationalism. In simple terms, Europe is headed for an era of my country first, and Germany leaving NATO or the EU is no longer unthinkable. It's becoming inevitable. You know, Merkel was the one that stood up in Munich during Trump's first term, and said, "We can no longer depend on the United States. Europe must find its own way forward." Shortly thereafter, you had Macron talk about NATO as being brain dead. But what happened? Nothing. In other words, the Europeans went back to sitting on their rear ends and to have to get up in their corner and get to work, because Germany is in a lot of trouble economically and socially. All these countries are overrun with people from North Africa and the Middle East that they never asked for and don't want. They're dealing with incredible criminality that they're unaccustomed to. I mean, Germany used to be probably one of the safest countries in the world, as was Sweden, as was Norway and Denmark. All of a sudden, that's gone. That's not the case anymore. The Germans don't like it, but they're afraid to do anything about it, because they're part of this European community where they are constantly told they're bad. They're bad. Germans are bad. Germans are Nazis, and so forth. They've had it. It's like everything else. Eventually people do wake up and react, and they are tired of being humiliated. So Mance, I think, is somebody who's going to culminate. Time to do all of these things, but it's not hard to see the handwriting on the wall. And we should welcome this. We should say, look, it's time for you to be on your own, and we want to help you. The biggest mistake we can make is to insist, no, we want you to remain our vassal state. That would be catastrophic, and we need to not do that. Macgregor's message here is unmistakable. Europe kept warning that it needed independence, but never acted. Now, the crisis is forcing it. Germany is overwhelmed economically, socially, and politically. And the old guilt narrative that kept it passive is breaking down. In simple terms, a Germany that's tired, pressured, and humiliated will eventually choose sovereignty over submission. And the smartest thing the U.S. can do now is step back, not cling tighter. Because trying to keep Germany as a vassal wouldn't prevent collapse.